Fleabag appears on the screen describing exactly what is wrong with her, walks into therapy with the words ready, and sits in a confession booth naming every broken pattern out loud. The more she names it, the more stuck she stays. If you have spent years getting better at describing your patterns and watched nothing change, you have felt a gap all the right things never named. They taught you how to see. They never named what to do. Fleabag is standing exactly where that step begins. This step is older than therapy and older than psychology. Every country that has ever existed runs on it. A country starts as a declaration. A small group of people sign a document that names what this place is, what it stands for, who it belongs to, what kind of nation it intends to be. At the moment of signing, none of it is true yet. The government does not function. Other countries do not recognize them. The institutions named in the document haven't been built. The borders the document claims are still drawn on someone else's map. The declaration runs years ahead of any evidence that the country it describes can hold together. That gap between the declaration and the evidence is where every founding actually lives. The first decade after a country declares itself is a sustained crisis where the declaration is real and almost nothing else is. Government offices are improvised. Currency is temporary. The people inside the new borders are still carrying the identity of whoever ruled them last. The only thing organizing the work is the declaration that was held in place through the years it had no proof. The institutions form around the declaration. They organize toward it, slowly, piece by piece, until the declaration is the country. The declaration produces the country. The country never produced the declaration. A population waiting for evidence of nationhood before declaring nationhood will wait permanently. Nothing forms without the declaration. The declaration is the operation. Everything else follows from it. The principle is exact. The declaration comes first. The system organizes around it. The evidence arrives last. From that sequence in reverse, and nothing builds. Now think of every declaration you have made over the past 5 years. Every time you stopped, named something specific you were going to do or stop doing or become, and committed. Count them. Now count how many are still running. Hold both numbers. We are coming back to them. Watch what Fleabag does inside the therapist's office. Watch the gap that opens. It is the same gap the new country sits inside for its first decade. A country sat in that gap for years before its institutions caught up to its declaration. Flea sits in a chair across from a stranger and has been sitting in that gap for most of her adult life, with one difference. The country had a declaration. She has the diagnosis of why no declaration has formed. She has every word for the absence. The words have not built anything. Watch what happens when she opens her mouth. The setup is two chairs facing each other. Flea sits on the left, the therapist sits on the right, and the frame holds on both of them. The therapist asks why she's there, and Flea answers in one continuous sentence.
I think because my mother died and he can't talk about it, and my sister and I didn't speak for a year because she thinks I tried to sleep with her husband, and because I spent most of my adult life using sex to deflect from the screaming void inside my empty heart.
She finishes the sentence, looks at us, and adds,
I'm good at this.
She is indeed good at it. That line is exact. The mechanism gets named. The void gets specified. And the deflection gets defined by what it does. All of it delivered in one breath in front of someone trained to hear exactly that. The therapist follows with the obvious questions about family, friends, the pattern that brought her in. Each question lands, and Flea answers cleanly. A guinea pig instead of friends. The impulse for sex is still running even after she stopped acting on it. The person she cannot have because he is not available. Every question gets the answer it was asking for, named with the same precision she used the first time. Eventually, the therapist hands the description back to her.
Just a girl with no friends and an empty heart. By your own description.
Flea pushes back, claims she has friends, turns her head a fraction of a degree, looks directly at us, and winks.
I have friends.
Oh, so you do have someone to talk to.
Yeah.
The session continues. She admits she wants to sleep with the priest. The therapist asks the harder question, and Flea deflects again into a joke.
Do you really want to fuck the priest, or do you want to fuck God?
Just please tell me how to not fuck a priest before I get arrested.
The therapist starts to break down what's happening with the priest, and Flea cuts her off.
Can you just tell me what to do?
This is a key line the scene turns on. She has been describing her patterns for several minutes. The descriptions have not produced any action she can take, and she arrives at a request that the therapist tell her what to do with them. The therapist responds.
You already know what you're going to do. Everybody does.
What?
You've already decided what you're going to do.
So what's the point in you?
You know what you're going to do.
No, I don't.
Yes, you do.
I don't.
You do.
I don't.
You do.
I don't.
The volley ends, and the scene ends with both of them sitting exactly where they started. Everything she said is sitting in the room with them. The pattern has a name. The mechanism is laid out, and nothing about her position has moved. Reread what just happened with the founding declaration in your hand. The country sat in the decade-long gap with the declaration as its only operating principle. Flea sits in the same gap with the operation missing. The diagnosis is precise. The words for every pattern are fluent and continue to develop in real time across the session. None of the words are the operation. The operation is the declaration. She has not made one. Sex as deflection is a mythology she has been running on for as long as she can remember, and someone else made it for her. In the same way the rulers of any country make the mythology the population experiences as how life works. That mythology is producing the pool the therapist names. When she told her that she already knew what she was going to do. The pool is real. It is directed. It was directed before she walked into the room. The therapist is doing the work correctly. The applied pressure, the recognition, the naming all land at the step the words on offer don't name. She doesn't refuse to make the declaration. There is no declaration available to refuse. The articulation she has been doing for several minutes has been substituting for the operation. It's what comes instead. The wing is the visible form of instead. She turns her head and lands the articulation outside the frame, with us. The volley is the threshold itself. The loop holds because no description reaches where the decision lives. You know this feeling. You sit with someone who can hear the pattern, or you write the entry that finally names it, or you say it out loud to the friend who has been waiting for you to see it, and the words land. The words click into place. The mechanism is visible. The pattern has a name. Something feels like movement. Nothing has moved. In the next morning, the pattern is still running. The words came home with you and changed nothing. 3 weeks later, you are in the same chair, with a sharper version of the same words, naming the pattern in more detail than before. The position didn't change even when the words got better. And that is the gap. That gap is not a private problem. Every lasting structure on Earth crosses it without apology and is praised for the crossing. Every nation and institution that has ever existed declared what it stood for before the evidence supported the declaration, and the nation organized itself around the words. Every corporation worth naming announced what it was before a single quarter of results confirmed it, and the market organized around the announcement. Every political movement that ever changed anything named a future that did not yet exist and pulled millions of people toward it. Every religious institution rewrote the messy history that came before it into a clean story of what its people are and what they are for, and built civilizations on the rewrite. Nobody calls any of this delusional. It is called leadership. It is called vision. It is called nation building. It is called strategy. The instant one person attempts the same operation inside their own life, declares a state before the evidence supports it, holds an internal position that current conditions have not confirmed, the language changes. The operation gets called fantasizing, lying to yourself, not being grounded, toxic positivity. The exact mechanic that every powerful structure on Earth uses without a bit of shame gets pathologized the moment an individual turns it inward. That double standard did not arrive by accident. A population trained to believe that individual myth-making is illusion is a population that only runs the myths someone else authored, the myths handed down by institutions, by culture, by whatever regime happens to hold the pen. The stigma against the operation is what keeps the operation locked. What you just watch in Fleabag's chair has a name. This is Axiom 10, one of 46 I have systematized from philosophy, neuroscience, and pattern analysis. I call it the myths. What I mean by that is this: every lasting change in your life, at any scale and in any domain, follows the same sequence. The internal state comes first, action organizes around it, an external form follows. Most people run the sequence in reverse, waiting for conditions to change before they let themselves occupy the state those conditions will produce. And the reversal is why effort keeps collapsing while the same cycles keep restarting. The operation underneath the sequence is myth authorship. Authorship means declaring a state ahead of the available evidence. The declaration gets held through the gap until the system around you starts reorganizing the warrant. Flea has not authored one. Sex as deflection is a story created somewhere outside her. This story has been running her decisions the way every regime's mythology runs the population it governs. She did not declare it. She inherited it. The only declaration available to her in the chair was a description of how thoroughly she has been inheriting it. That gap between description and declaration has its own name in my framework. I call it articulation as substitute. Articulation as substitute is what runs when the description tools are sharp and the authorship operating is missing. This system uses the only tool it has: language, naming, mapping the pattern. The tool gets routed to the position where the declaration was supposed to be. The articulation gets more precise. The pattern gets more visible. The mechanism gets named. And nothing organizes, because description does not organize. Authorship organizes. Articulation is what comes instead. This is the gap every depth tradition leaves at its threshold. The traditions taught the seeing, and they refined it across thousands of years. The traditions never named the operation that seeing was supposed to fit into. The operation requires authorship. Authorship requires a declaration that runs ahead of the evidence. And no depth tradition produces a permission structure for that move. So here is what mainstream depth advice tells you to do when you arrive where Flea is sitting. Keep articulating. Refine the description. Find a sharper version of the same truth. Identify the pattern more precisely. Name the deeper version of what you have already named. Sit with it longer. Trust that clarity itself is the path. The reading is real. The naming is real. The depth tradition that produced therapy, that produced contemplative practice, that produced all the words you used to describe yourself the last time you arrived at the same wall. That tradition built tools that work. The work ends where the operation begins. Reading is not authorship. The clearest description of a mythology that has been running you for 30 years does not produce a competing one. The most precise naming of a deflection mechanism does not produce a declaration. Describing the absence of a declaration is a description of the absence. It is not the declaration. The traditions taught a population how to read the system that was running them, and the traditions did not teach the same population how to write inside it. A population that reads its own mythology and never authors a competing one is a population that stays inside whoever wrote the mythology first. That is what the depth tradition gap does. And the function is the design. The reading is permitted. The authorship is pathologized. And the representation of that gap is the woman Flea is, articulate enough to name every pattern, with no path the tradition gave her toward authoring her way out of one. Now, knowing what articulation as substitute is, what do you think happens when she walks into a confessional booth with the same articulation, in front of someone trained to hand her direction? That was a private session. What comes next is older. People have been walking into it for hundreds of years. The form was built for declaration. A person walks in, names the position they are taking and how they will live from this point forward, and the form holds the declaration through the gap. The church has had centuries to refine that operation, and she walks into it. The mood inside the booth starts light. They are treating it more like a game than a serious confession. She offers the priest the kind of confession that is expected in this context. She confesses a lie, a theft, and the sex she wasn't supposed to have. The smile is on the whole time. The priest doesn't accept the version she is giving. He asks her to go on. The smile starts to fade. She hums for a bit, and then she says one word.
I can't
It's okay, go on.
Frightened.
Of what? He says.
Forgetting things. People. Forgetting people.
That sentence is the closest the scene gets to a declaration. It's a description of something already running inside her, and she moves away from it the moment he wants to know what she wants. Then the smile comes back, but it isn't the same smile. It's more like a smile of someone when they cannot believe what they are about to say.
I want someone to tell me what to wear in the morning.
The priest starts to answer, and she cuts him off and goes harder.
I think there are people who can...
No, I want someone to tell me what to wear every morning. I want someone to tell me what to believe in, who to vote for, and who to love, and how to tell them. I just think I want someone to tell me how to live my life, Father, because so far I think I've been getting it wrong.
Listen to what's actually inside that sentence. The list is structured. Every item is a category, a domain a person runs by holding a position about it. She's going down the list and asking, item by item, for someone else to hold the position. The articulation is sharp and precise, and it's naming, one by one, every place where a declaration of her own is missing. And she isn't done.
Even though I don't believe your bullshit, and I know that scientifically nothing that I do makes any difference in the end anyway, I'm still scared. Why am I still scared? Just fucking tell me what to do, Father.
The priest answers with one word.
Kneel.
What?
Kneel.
She kneels. He comes around to her side of the booth and kisses her. He keeps kissing her until a portrait on the wall falls and breaks the moment. They stop and he leaves her there. She turns toward us, no longer smiling. Listen to what she did inside her own monologue. She named two systems she doesn't believe: the priest's religious framework and the scientific reading that nothing she does matters in the end. She rejected both in the same breath, and in the same breath she asked the priest for direction. The contradiction is in the words. She wants direction from a doctrine she just called bullshit. The content of the framework is incidental. The supply of direction is a variable. The whole list is articulation as substitute at full development. She hands every life category she has across the partition, all of it delivered with the precision the depth tradition trained into her. The articulation was impeccable, but not a single declaration was made in that scene. Then the direction she asks for arrived. He came around and initiated. And the substitute mechanism that's been running everything else took the moment and turned it into another instance of itself. What we saw with the therapist showed the threshold. This confession showed the next layer down. Articulation runs at full development across every domain. The request for direction is explicit, said out loud at maximum charge, addressed to a form built to receive it. The substitute takes the direction at the moment it arrives. The depth tradition produced the articulation. The form she walked into was built for the operation the articulation has been substituting for. The form received articulation. It did not receive the operation. You know the feeling. Nothing is working. The behaviors and habits keep repeating. The desperation builds quietly across weeks and then loudly across days. And the brain reaches for someone to hand you the answer. A coach you found last month. A book you saw recommended on a podcast. A friend who hasn't figured out their own life. Whatever it is, the shape of the wanting is what she said in the booth. Just tell me what to do. A lot of the time, you don't believe them. You've already debunked the coach. You've already watched the book's promises fail to land. The asking continues anyway, because the asking was never about the content. The asking is about not having to hold the position yourself. And the part that's harder to look at. Every time the asking gets answered, the same articulation as substitute that's been running everything else takes the answer and turns it into more articulation. And this leads us to one question. Why? The reason runs 3 layers deep, and all 3 sit underneath what you can see. The first layer is sensation. Recognition produces a felt event. Naming a pattern triggers something specific in the brain. It could be a flash of clarity. It could be the words clicking into place, or the sense that you have just seen how the thing works. The system reads that flash as forward motion. And even when they all can be real, none of those events is the operation. The operation is a declaration, which produces a different kind of internal event entirely. The system has been trained for so long to read recognition as a work that it doesn't know what declaration is supposed to feel like. The substitute feels like the work because the substitute is what the depth tradition trained the system to do. Max Bennett's research on how the brain evolved shows the same thing in brain chemistry. Dopamine fires on approach, almost there. The opioids fire on arrival. Articulation lights up the approach chemistry every time. Naming a habit, mapping a mechanism, identifying a wound, getting the words right. Every one of these registers as almost there. The system has been broadcasting almost there for as long as the substitute has been running. The arrival chemistry never fires because arrival requires a different operation, and the operation never runs. The second layer is refinement. Each iteration of the description gets sharper. The pattern Flea named in the first session becomes the pattern she names with surgical precision in the third. The articulation matures. The words deepens. The mechanism becomes more visible. The problem is that you mistake the maturing for movement, and what is maturing is the substitute itself. Developing in place, getting better at its function, all while the function continues to be substitution. Years of practice make any tool sharper and it works no different, with articulation as a tool. It gets sharper across thousands of hours of recognition work, and this sharpness never converts into authorship, because sharpness is not the threshold operation. The threshold operation requires a different move, a declaration that runs ahead of the evidence. Csikszentmihalyi spends decades studying flow. He found the same mechanism at the level of motivation. States generate goals. Description names the goals the existing state is already producing. Description does not produce a new state. A new state will produce different goals automatically without the necessity of anyone naming them. That is the entire mechanism in one line, and you should really internalize it. States generate goals. Articulation operates at the level of the goals. Authorship operates at the level of the state. Work done at one layer does not transfer to the other. The third layer is the routing. When direction arrives from any place, the direction enters a system that has been organized around the substitute for years. The system's default routing is articulation. Every signal coming in, every instruction, or every framework, every piece of advice runs through the articulation router on its way to whatever it was supposed to become. The confession showed it cleanly. The priest said one word. The form was built for that word to land as declaration. The system that received the word had no machinery for landing declaration, only machinery for processing words. The word got processed. The processing produced a kiss, a contradiction, and another bit of articulation directed at the camera. What happened to the supplied direction was absorption. The default router did what default routers do. It ran the input to the path everything else runs through. This is why imported directions never produce the change you are asking for. When the directions arrive intact, the routing converts them into more substitute. And each cycle compounds. The substitute that ran today registered to the system as work performed. Tomorrow's articulation starts from a system that confirmed yesterday's articulation as work. 3 years of this, and the system has thousands of hours of confirmed substitute on its ledger. The actual operation has gotten further away across exactly the period that felt like progress. Donella Meadows spent 30 years mapping how leverage works in systems. The same mechanism shows up at the level of systems theory. The most powerful leverage point in any system is the paradigm, the story the system runs on. The least powerful is the parameter, the visible variables. Articulation operates at parameter level. It describes what the system is producing. Declaration operates at paradigm level. It authors the story the system runs on. Decades of parameter adjustment produces no change at the level of the system. The reason is structural. Real work was done at the wrong leverage point. The ego prefers articulation to declaration for a reason that has nothing to do with cowardice. Declaration replaces it. The ego that took over after grief runs a specific story about who you are, the broken one, the deflector, the one who cannot, the one who has to. Articulation describes that story. Description leaves the story in place. Authorship writes a different story over the top of it. The ego permits articulation because articulation does not threaten its position. The ego encourages articulation because articulation looks, from the outside, like the work being done. Years of this produce someone widely rewarded as doing the inner work, while the ego underneath sits exactly where it has always been. The honest looking is the proof the arrangement is working. The arrangement got described in detail and remained in place. This is what makes the substitute durable. Not stupidity, not laziness, not insufficient depth. This substitute holds because the chemistry of articulation broadcasts approach without a rival. The refinement of articulation matures the substitute in place. The routing converts every supply direction into more substitute on entry, and the ego underneath the whole arrangement keeps its position by encouraging the operation. Recognizing the substitute is articulation about articulation, one more iteration of the same default routing. The mechanic remains intact. The question that remains is whether the operation ever runs. Whether anyone, including Flea, ever crosses the threshold the depth tradition stops at, even once, even if it's briefly, just in one domain. This show's last scene is the answer. Watch carefully. The scene is doing something the show has never done before, and the show ends with it. So we are in a bus stop after a wedding. The priest has just delivered a sermon about love that everyone in the room heard a little too clearly. The two of them slept together the night before. Whatever they are to each other has not been settled. Flea is sitting on the bench, waiting. The priest joins her. They make a small talk about the boss, about her father, and about her sister. Each topic gets covered with half attention. The conversation they are actually having is the one underneath. After her last comment about her sister, the talking stops, and they look at each other for a few seconds without saying anything. Then she gets it.
It's God, isn't it?
Yeah.
What she says next is the line that runs the operation.
You know, the worst thing is that I fucking love you. I love you.
He starts to say something. He has a response ready, but she stops him and continues.
No, no, don't. No, let's just leave that out there just for a second on its own.
Then she says it once more.
I love you.
He looks at her. reaches for her hand and tells her gently that it will pass. She smiles. The declaration she made has already been held for the length of time it needed to be held. She doesn't need him to confirm it, or absorb it, or talk her out of it. She has already said it ahead of the moment when saying it would have been safe. And that part of the operation has already run. His response arrives after the moment the declaration needed to be left alone. She lets the words land and holds his hand in return. They lean their heads toward each other and get close enough to kiss. The priest pulls back because the life he chooses will not let him do the thing his body is moving toward. He says he's going to walk. He gets up and starts to leave. He turns around and says,
See you Sunday? I'm joking, you're never ever allowed in my church again. I love you too.
Then he keeps walking. The frame returns to her face. She is crying. She sits there on the bench, holding the small statue based on her mother, the one she ended up with through a long sequence of small tests and absurdities across the show. Then she gets up to walk. What happens next is the part the entire show has been building toward. She turns and looks at the camera. She shakes her head and smiles. And nothing else happens. The camera does not follow her. It stays where it is. She walks away alone, in a single take, while the camera stays at the bench and watches her go. What happened in those 2 minutes is the operation the Axiom names. She makes a declaration that runs ahead of the evidence she has. The conditions that would have made the declaration safe, knowing what they are to each other, knowing if the priest will change his mind, knowing what comes next. None of those conditions are present. She declares anyway. She says "I love you" with no joke, no aside, no wink at the audience, no signal that she is performing a feeling for them. The form of articulation the show has been demonstrating up to this point stops. Declaration takes its place. Then comes the part the rest of the operation depends on. When the priest tries to soften the declaration with kindness, she stops him. She stopping him is the second part of the operation, and it has a name. At the beginning of the video, we named the gap. And this is what crossing that gap sounds like. Holding through the gap is the refusal to let the declaration get smoothed over. She holds it, and he does not absorb it. For a few seconds, the declaration exists ahead of any frame either of them could put around it. Then she walks, turns, and gives the substitute nothing to do. The fourth wall has been the destination of every aside, every wink, every articulated thought in the show. The substitute has a visible form in this show, and the visible form is the camera. When she turns and tilts her head and smiles and says nothing, what runs is recognition. She acknowledges the substitute is there. and she does not deploy it. The camera does not follow her, because there is no articulation to follow. Articulation has somewhere else to be. For the first time, it has a declaration to point back at. The substitute goes silent because the routing got reorganized for half a minute. The direction the priest gave, the kind it will pass, landed on the declaration itself, where it normally would have been turned into more substitute on the way in. So the show ends. It ends because the operation ran once. Flea did not transform. The grief, the substitute machinery, her whole working pattern, none of that reorganizes in 2 minutes at a bus stop. The ego that took over after the original loss is still in place. The articulation as substitute machinery, quiet for a moment during the operation, is intact and capable of running again. What ran was one operational myth, in one domain, for 30 seconds. The skill is raw. Her whole system did not reorganize. The work the Axiom names begins where the show stops. And this has happened to you too. Somewhere in your life, you have said something that ran ahead of the evidence you had. You said something about who you are, or what you will do, or who you loved, or what you refused, and the words established a position ahead of any evidence you had to support it. You will have to live up to that position from that moment forward. When you said it, someone tried to soften it. You didn't let them. For 30 seconds, or 2 minutes, or one held silence at the dinner table, or on a phone call, or whatever. The thing you had said was allowed to exist ahead of the evidence that will catch up to it later. You also know what happened next. Nothing reorganized. Your life continued. And the same patterns that had been running before kept running. The part of you that turns everything else into manageable shapes went back to work. The declaration receded, and the substitute came back. The show ended at the threshold of an operation it could not stage past one running. The bus stop was the demonstration of a declaration ahead of evidence, held briefly, in a single scene, in a single domain, at the close of a story that needed the operation once and then ran the credits. What sits past that threshold is what the show couldn't show. The show was a story with a final episode, and the operation Axiom 10 names is something else. It is a craft. The threshold operation, run once, leaves the system at its existing default. The routing layer holds. The substitute machinery doesn't lose ground. One declaration is a single override against a routing structure that returns to default. What reorganizes the system is the practiced version of the operation. The same move runs across many declarations. in many domains, held long enough that the routing layer stops treating each declaration as an exception and begins treating declaration as the new default. This substitute remains available. The articulation engine stays in place. The routing reorganizes around the practiced authorship, and the substitute fires less often because the routing no longer reaches for it first. The practice version begins with the recognition that not every declaration faces the same kind of suppression. The operation has three forms, and the system's response changes depending on which form is being attempted. Knowing which form you are running is what lets you recognize which encounter is about to arrive. The first form is declaration from nothing, a state with no precedent inside your existing arrangement. You declare a thing you have never been, and you hold it in the gap between the declaration and the absent proof. The system's counter to this form is fraud. The gap between what is declared and what the evidence shows is wide. The feeling of lying arrives immediately, in your body, with so much authority that it is its own verdict. The body produces the argument before the ego needs to construct one. The declaration gets abandoned within hours or days, and the abandonment gets framed as honesty, while the system has shut down a declaration before it could draw resources. The second form is recovery, a state occupied at some point in your past that the system hid, rewrote, or filed as an anomaly. An old habit you abandoned and you want to retake. You reclaim a position that was real once, and that the system has spent years reorganizing around the absence of. The system's counter to this form is minimization. Fraud will not work, because the historical evidence exists and the body remembers. So the counter needs to be different. The evidence gets reframed as temporary, a one-time thing, a product of conditions that no longer apply. That was a different time, a time where you were younger. The situation carried you. The recovery has real foundation, and the system's job is to make that foundation feel too weak to build on. The reclamation gets converted into nostalgia, while the legitimate operational position the recovery represents goes unclaimed. The third form is extension, a state already true at some level, reaching for the next version of itself. Current evidence supports the existing position, and the declaration pushes from that floor into territory the evidence has not confirmed. The system's counter to this form is risk framing. The declaration is true in its base, so fraud will not work and minimization cannot land. The counter turns the existing stability into a weapon. Why risk what's working? Losing what you have is not worth what you might gain. Real ground gets converted into a ceiling. The platform the declaration would have launched from gets reframed as a position to defend. These three forms, declaration from nothing, recovery, and extension, and their three counters, fraud, minimization, and risk framing cover every category. Every suppression activates its matching counter. The practiced version of the operation begins with knowing which form is running. The suppression that arrives carries information about which kind of myth is being authored, and the verdict it delivers has no authority over whether the myth deserves to survive. Recognizing the form is the diagnostic dimension. What gives a declaration its operational weight? What turns a sentence set in front of a mirror or written on a page into something the system reorganizes around is structural. There are three components every authored myth carries, no matter which of the three forms it takes. The first component is the state declared ahead of its evidence. This is the founding move. A declaration that describes where you currently are is reporting. A declaration that names a goal you intend to reach is the reversed sequence the system has been running you on. The self-declaration is the state itself, claimed as operational fact in present tense, with the evidence missing. The gap between the declaration and the proof is the position the myth runs from. The second component is a chosen trajectory. A declaration without direction has no mythology to organize. It operates as a wish, a mood, or an affirmation that drifts because nothing is pulling on it. The trajectory is what the declaration commits the system to. A declaration of "I am someone who finishes things" commits the system to a trajectory where finishing organizes effort. Unfinished work registers as friction. The routing layer treats completion as native and incompletion as departure. The trajectory is what gives the declaration a shape the system can reorganize around. The third component is a repeatable hold. A declaration held once is a moment. The operation that turns a declaration into operational policy is the hold across time. The same declaration gets held through the gap on Tuesday, on Thursday, on the morning the body wakes up tired. On the afternoon, the evidence has not arrived. The ritual dimension carries the operational weight. The repeatability is what separates an author myth from serial myth making, where the ego uses the language of authorship to produce a constant bunch of new declarations that never get held long enough for any of them to demand anything. A state declared ahead of its evidence, a chosen trajectory, and a repeatable hold. Those three components hold across all three forms, expressed differently depending on which form is being authored. What they share is what the operation consists of. This leaves the invitation the show could not extend. You have watched the operation get demonstrated once. Watch the substitute pattern get named at three structural layers, reorganized in your life the moment of having crossed a threshold once without reorganizing what came after. The work is the same operation Flea did, executed by you, in a domain you choose, at a scale you decide. Pick one domain, the position you have been waiting for evidence to grant you permission to occupy, the state you have been treating as something the next promotion, the next relationship, the next body, or the next quarter will eventually produce once the conditions cleared. Identify which of the three forms the declaration will take. It is from nothing if the state has no precedent inside your existing life. It is recovery if the state was real once and the system has tagged it as past. It is extension if the current ground is solid and the next version is the move. Declared in present tense, ahead of its evidence, claimed as the operational state from which the next decisions get made. The first thing that arrives will be the counter, depending on which form you choose. The feeling lands as a verdict. It is weathered inside the gap, with no authority to issue verdicts. The gap is the position the operation runs from. Hold the declaration through it. Make the next decision from the declared state before the evidence arrives to confirm it. Let the trajectory organize the day, the week, the month, even the year, as the direction effort flows from. Imperfect action stays inside the territory of holding. Repeat the declaration the next time the system reaches for the substitute. Doing it once will not reorganize the system. You have heard that several times in this video, and it is the part that is most true. The first declaration you authored will produce a small override against a routing structure that has been running for decades. The override will fire once. The routing will return to its default. The substitute will run the next morning as though nothing happened. That is the expectation. A single declaration cannot perform the reorganization. The practice version is what does, built from one declaration becoming many domains, held over enough time that the routing layer no longer recognizes its own original default. The position is what shifted in this video. The threshold this show stopped at is the position you are standing on now. This is one axiom inside a system. The system holds 65 axioms. Each one is a layer of the machinery. Each is a place where the substitute can run. Each is an operation the depth tradition gap leaves unbuilt. Each is a threshold the work has to cross. I have already taught the layer this video pairs with Freddy from the movie Return to Cebu. That video teaches what compensatory mobilization looks like. If this explains something, subscribe and like the video. Thanks for watching.